I remember that Monday morning like it was yesterday, gray skies, a cold wind rolling in from the lake, and the kind of stillness that always comes before something breaks. Just the day before, I'd been finalizing plans for an upcoming client retreat, running through quarterly reports with my assistant. But that morning, a short message lit up on my phone. The CEO would like to see you at 2 p.m. Executive boardroom, 12th floor. No explanation, no context. But I knew, after 27 years with Halden Myers Publishing, from the early days in a cramped Syracuse office to becoming a nationally recognized name, I'd developed a sense for things, especially when something wasn't right. My name is Richard Lane, and for nearly 3 decades, I ran the entire Northeast Division. I wasn't flashy. I didn't rely on jargon or data dashboards. I built my network with firm handshakes, handwritten notes, and decades of trust. I remember birthdays. I attended funerals. I sat across dinner tables with authors and small publishers alike because I believed that this business, like any real business, was built on people, not platforms. But at 61 years old with prostate cancer just recently in remission, I'd also come to understand something else. Loyalty doesn't always buy justice. When I stepped into that sleek, glass-paneled boardroom that afternoon, I found Elena Cross, our freshly appointed CEO, seated beside a corporate stranger from HR. The room was ice cold, but it was her stare cool, calculated, and rehearsed that told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. Elena would like to speak with you directly, her assistant muttered, before slipping out of the room like someone trying to avoid witnessing something unpleasant. I took a seat, calm on the outside but with every fiber of my body bracing for the inevitable. Elena folded her hands neatly, her voice as smooth and sterile as the steel frame table between us. Richard, you've given a lot to this company, but to move forward, we need a younger, more digitally aligned direction, someone better suited for the evolving landscape. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I just nodded, quietly, listening as she wrapped 27 years of work into a polished termination pitch. No anger, no drama. I walked out of that room with my dignity intact and 3 decades of history packed into a single, silent goodbye. What she didn't realize, and what none of them at the top ever seemed to, was that being replaced doesn't mean you're finished. Back when Halden Myers was still a modest regional firm operating out of a red brick building near downtown Syracuse, I walked through its doors with nothing but a worn leather briefcase and a Rolodex filled with names I had earned the hard way through years of driving from one small town publisher to another, shaking hands over coffee-stained kitchen tables and dusty bookstore counters. I just walked away from a well-paid, well-respected position at Davenport Sloan, a massive New York publishing house that had grown too corporate, too cold. The new leadership there saw books as products, not legacies, and I couldn't stomach the transformation any longer. Martin Halden, the founder of Halden Myers, didn't care about digital trends or quarterly growth projections. When he hired me, he said, "I don't need someone who can talk about market penetration. I need someone who remembers that stories matter because people matter." That sentence stuck with me. It still does. For the first 5 years, I rebuilt the entire Northeastern Division from the ground up. I drove over 80 miles a year, visiting every independent press between Pennsylvania and Maine. I didn't just know the names of the publishers. I knew their families, their fears, the manuscript they buried in a drawer, and the authors they had to convince themselves to believe in. I attended weddings, funerals, graduations. I wrote sympathy cards by hand and showed up at retirement parties with stories instead of speeches. Not because any of that was strategic, but because that was who we were back then, and that was who I am. Under Martin's leadership, we grew slowly, honestly, and with heart. When he retired a decade later, his son Andrew Halden took over. Andrew had a head for numbers, and while he lacked his father's instinct for people, he was smart enough to leave the regional directors alone. He respected the machine because he saw the results. By that point, my region was generating more than half of the company's annual revenue, and I didn't need a fancy CRM system to make it happen. I had trust. But 3 years ago, things started to change. Andrew was diagnosed with cancer pancreatic, aggressive, and merciless. And while he fought it bravely, we all knew. There was a heaviness that hung over every executive meeting, a sense that something essential was slipping away. When Andrew passed last spring, everything shifted. not in an explosion, but like a slow, landslide, silent, inevitable. The board, suddenly leaderless and nervous about the future, began throwing around terms that had never been part of our vocabulary. Scalability, optimization, digital overhaul. At first, I dismissed it as harmless talk, the kind of corporate buzz that drifts through boardrooms but rarely reaches the field. But then came the consultant's young, sharp-dressed strategist from the West Coast who barely understood the industry but had plenty of charts to prove they did. They sat in on meetings, whispered to the board, and left behind slide decks filled with phrases like phasing out legacy practices and reducing dependency on analog client relations. That's when Elena Cross entered the picture. She was everything the board thought they needed. Tech, savvy, data obsessed, confident to the point of arrogance. She didn't come from publishing. Her background was in SaaS sales and product automation, but she spoke with the certainty of someone who believed efficiency mattered more than empathy. And the board, desperate for transformation, ate up every word. At first, I kept my distance. I stayed focused on my clients, kept delivering results, and made sure my team never missed a quarterly target. But I could feel it happening, inch by inch. One day, they reassigned 2 of my long-term accounts without notice. The next, they added junior digital engagement managers to my division and told me they reported directly to Elena. When I voiced concern, I was told to collaborate, not control. Then came the whispers. My assistant, Michael, whom I had mentored for years, began receiving invitations to strategy meetings that no one ever told me about. When I asked him what was going on, he looked down and said, "They're talking about reorganization, digital first realignment." Your name came up. It would have been easier to take if I hadn't just finished my final round of radiation therapy the week before. At a time when my body was barely holding itself together, when every morning felt like a mountain to climb, I still showed up. I still put in the hours. I still traveled mask on, meds in my bag because I believed I owed it to my team, to my clients, and to the company I had helped build. But none of that mattered. Not to them. They didn't see the miles on my car or the nights I spent away from my family. They didn't see the late calls, the contract renewals salvaged by a single phone conversation, or the fact that clients didn't work with Halden, Meyerstay worked with me. To the new leadership, I was a relic, a complication, a symbol of a slower, outdated world they were eager to erase. What they failed to see, what they still don't understand is that in this business, relationships don't depreciate with time. They deepen. And when you trade trust for trends, eventually the numbers catch up to you. When I was first diagnosed, the doctor's words came slowly, measured, and clinical, but they landed like a hammer all the same. Stage 2 prostate cancer treatable, yes, but serious, and demanding a level of focus and care I wasn't sure I could afford. Not because I didn't value my health, but because walking away from the business, even temporarily, felt unthinkable. There were clients who depended on me, a team that looked to me for direction, and an entire region still outperforming every other in the company. At 61, I wasn't ready to be seen as the sick one. I had spent my life being the steady one, so I didn't tell Año Nino at first. I scheduled radiation appointments early in the morning or late in the evening, carefully planned travel around treatment cycles, and kept my suit pressed and my smile practiced. Only a handful of people knew, including my wife Maggie and my assistant Michael, who quietly covered for me on the bad days when fatigue wrapped around my bones like wet cement. I had thought, foolishly perhaps, that loyalty and resilience would buy me time, that the company I had poured my life into might repay that devotion with just a little patience. I was wrong. While I was navigating the hardest physical battle of my life, Elena Cross and her team were quietly rewriting the structure of the company behind closed doors. Strategy meetings began happening without me. Invitations to leadership calls stopped coming, and decisions that once required my signature were being carried out without so much as a courtesy email. I noticed subtle shifts first. Long-standing accounts reassigned to new hires I'd never interviewed, territory lines redrawn under the pretense of efficiency, and internal memos praising digital integration while conveniently omitting the traditional sales division entirely. I told myself it was temporary, that once I got through treatment, once I showed them I wasn't going anywhere, things would settle. But then Michael came into my office one afternoon, his face pale, holding a confidential slide deck someone had left in the shared drive by mistake. It was a restructuring proposal, complete with new titles, a digital first chain of command, and a glaring absence my name. "You need to see this," he said, voice low, eyes scanning the hallway like he'd smuggled classified documents. And as I flipped through page after page of projected salary savings, organizational charts, and buzzwords like modernization and streamlined client interface, the realization settled over me like a second diagnosis. I wasn't just being phased out, I was being erased. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. I told myself I was being paranoid, that perhaps I was reading too much into spreadsheets made by people who didn't understand the human cost of change. But that hope crumbled the day Turner, Wells, our largest legacy account, called me directly. "Richard," Grant Turner said on the other end, "who's this kid who just told me he's taken over our account?" He knew nothing about our backlist, didn't ask a single question about our upcoming reprints, and spent half the call explaining analytics I never asked for. "What's going on over there?" I didn't have a good answer. I wanted to reassure him, to promise that nothing was changing, that I was still in charge, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not to Grant. Not to a man who'd once held my shoulder at my father's funeral and told me he'd never take his publishing business anywhere else as long as I was still breathing. After I hung up, I sat in my office, lights off, blinds drawn, and stared at the framed photo on my bookshelf me, Martin Halden, and the original 5-person team from our early days. I barely recognized the man in the mirror anymore. Not because of the illness. That I could handle. But because, for the first time in my life, I felt irrelevant. It's a strange thing, watching something you've built with care and conviction get dismantled piece by piece, no, by accident or necessity, but by design. It wasn't just business strategy. It was betrayal, calculated and executed with smiles, performance reviews, and polite dismissals cloaked in language like realignment and emerging market fit. I wasn't bitter yet, just tired. Tired of pretending I didn't see what was happening. Tired of giving people the benefit of the doubt when every sign pointed to the truth. They were moving on without me. And not because I wasn't performing, but because I no longer fit the image they wanted to present to shareholders and consultants. I was the wrong age, with the wrong methods, recovering from the wrong disease, and despite everything I had given, they didn't even have the decency to say it out loud. The message came the following: Monday morning, clean, clinical, and precisely worded. Please report to the executive conference room at 2 p.m. HR will be present. That was it. No context, no warning. Just the kind of tone that made it clear the decision had already been made, and I was simply being called in to witness it. I spent the next hour finishing a call with Grant Turner, finalizing the terms of a 5-year renewal contract that, if signed, would bring in over $12 million in revenue. I didn't tell him what was happening. I couldn't. There was a hollow rhythm to my breathing, a kind of autopilot response in my voice. But I stayed composed because I'd spent decades building a name in this business, and I wasn't about to let it shatter now not when I was so close to the end. When I arrived at the boardroom, the setting had changed. The long oak conference table where I'd once sat beside Martin Halden to map our company's first cross-regional campaign was gone, replaced by glass walls and a sleek digital display that pulsed quietly with the company's new logo. Aesthetic upgrades, they said. A more modern identity. But to me, it felt sterile, soulless. Inside, Elena Cross sat with her back straight and her hands folded in that practiced, polished way she always adopted when delivering news she didn't want to be questioned on. Beside her sat someone from human resources I'd never seen before, young, impeccably dressed, and visibly uncomfortable. As soon as I stepped through the door, I felt it in the air. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a formality. "Richard," she began, her voice smooth as a PR statement, "we want to thank you for everything you've done over the years. But as we move toward a more digital-first approach, we need to restructure leadership to align with our long-term strategic goals." I listened. I didn't interrupt. Not when she mentioned realignment, not when she used words like agility, and certainly not when she leaned almost imperceptibly in phrases that clearly meant, "You're too old for this world we're creating." She never said it outright, of course, but it hung in the pauses between her sentences, as heavy and present as any truth too dangerous to admit out loud. When she finished, I stood, extended my hand, and thanked her for the opportunity to serve. No sarcasm, no scene, just quiet dignity, because if they were going to erase me, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. 15 years of loyalty, 10 times that many late nights. Over 60% of the company's annual revenue tied directly to my clients, and in return, a 15-minute meeting conducted with the efficiency of a canceled subscription. I returned to my office while the team was out for lunch. The silence was a relief. No awkward goodbyes, no sympathetic glances, no forced words from people unsure what to say. I packed my things methodically. The photo of my wife and daughter, the brass nameplate for my first desk, a few personal files and client thank you notes I'd collected over the years. I left the awards on the shelf. They belonged more to memory than to me now. The building felt unfamiliar as I walked out, as if I were leaving not just a job, but a version of myself I had spent decades cultivating. When I reached the parking lot, I sat in the driver's seat without starting the car, hands on the wheel, staring at the dashboard as if waiting for some part of this to reverse itself. My phone buzzed in the console. 3 missed calls from Grant, 2 from Eleanor Marsh at Riverbend Press. A flood of text messages had begun to arrive, and I hadn't told a single client yet. Word travels fast in this business. Whispers fly quicker than press releases, and loyalty, when it's earned through years of trust and dinners and quiet favors, doesn't dissolve just because someone else now holds the title. I looked out across the lot, toward the road leading away from the company I had helped build, and I felt something unexpected calm. Not because I had a plan. I didn't. Not yet. But because I had nothing left to prove. They had closed the door on me, but they had no idea what they'd just unlocked. The day after I was let go, I stayed home. I didn't tell Maggie right away. She was visiting our daughter in Cleveland, helping with the new baby, and I didn't want to burden her with something I wasn't even sure how to explain yet. I needed space not just to think, but to feel the weight of it all without interruption, without having to pretend I was fine. I spent that morning in my home office, staring at the wall behind my desk, where the framed photos of company retreats and client events still hung in perfect symmetry. The phone sat silent beside me, a dull, black shape that somehow felt heavier than usual. For a while, I simply sat there, as if waiting for something clarity maybe, or the kind of anger that gives you purpose but neither came. Then, just after noon, it rang. I let it go to voicemail, unsure if I was ready to talk. Then it rang again, and again. By the time the 5th call came through, I checked the screen. Grant Turner, again. And 3 missed calls from Eleanor Marsh, a dozen unread text messages, 2 emails flagged urgent from Dorian Bell at Western Range Press, and 1 from Hannah Leeds, who hadn't spoken to me since her retirement party 5 years earlier. I took a deep breath and finally picked up. What the hell happened, Richard? Grant's voice came through hot. No pleasantries, no preamble. Someone from your old office called me this morning, said my account was being reassigned. Some new executive strategist didn't know a damn thing about our backlist or our seasonal strategy. Spent the whole call talking about data segmentation and engagement metrics. Never once asked about our historical series or author rollouts. He even pronounced my editor's name wrong. I didn't answer right away. What could I say that wouldn't sound like bitterness or defeat? They're going in a new direction, I muttered eventually, repeating the sanitized phrase I'd been handed like it was gospel. Well, they're going to lose us if they keep this up, Grant snapped. You were the reason we stayed, Richard. You, not the company. They think relationships are something they can plug into a spreadsheet. They don't understand why we trusted you with our margins and manuscripts. After we hung up, I stood by the window and watched the wind move through the oak trees outside. Autumn had started creeping in, crisp and unapologetic. The kind of season where things fall apart quietly before they rebuild. My phone buzzed again. Eleanor Marsh this time. I heard what happened, she said without even waiting for a hello. It's their loss. You built that firm's identity for people like us. If you decide to do something else, I want in. By evening, the count had reached 12 calls from publishers I'd worked with for years. Some small, some major, all expressing the same sentiment. Confusion, frustration, and, most surprising of all, loyalty, not to Halden Myers. To me, one message stood out above the rest. a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. "Richard," the voicemail said, slow and deliberate. "This is Samuel Kent. You probably don't remember me, but you helped me renegotiate our distribution deal with Ridgeback back in 2011. I still use the language you drafted. I just heard you're no longer with the company. That's insane. If you ever think about consulting, well, just say the word." I sat back in my chair, the weight in my chest, shifting slightly, not lifting, not yet, but changing. For the first time since I'd been called into that boardroom, something stirred inside me that wasn't exhaustion or quiet rage. It was a memory of what I had built client by client, handshake by handshake, over countless long days and longer nights. They hadn't stayed because of the logo. They'd stayed because of trust. And if that trust hadn't left with my title, then maybe, just maybe, I wasn't done yet. That night, after the last call had been returned and the final text answered with a polite thank you, I sat in the quiet of my backyard, bourbon in hand, watching the last of the autumn sun bleed into the trees. The air smelled like smoke and pine, and there was a stillness to the evening that reminded me of the nights I used to spend on the road between client visits, small-town motels, tired feet, and the satisfaction of knowing I was building something real, even if no one else saw it yet. The calls had stirred something in me, not ambition. Not yet, but a quiet resolve that maybe, just maybe, the part of me they had tried to discard still had value. They told me I didn't belong in a world moving faster than I could adapt to. But what if the world wasn't the problem? What if it was them? What if the very things they'd written off as obsolete trust, personal connection, long-term thinking were the things people still needed, especially now? I didn't want revenge. That was never the point. What I wanted was to keep doing the work that mattered. The kind of work that couldn't be replaced by automation or buzzwords or 20-somethings fluent in disruption but tone-deaf to tradition. And if Halden Myers no longer had space for that kind of work, then perhaps it was time I created the space myself. The next morning, I called my attorney, Benjamin Weiss, a man I'd known for years, quiet, methodical, and never impressed by corporate muscle. I forwarded him the non-compete agreement I'd been handed on my way out, a stack of carefully worded clauses that tried to make decades of human relationships disappear with a signature. "They let you go?" he asked, surprised. "They did," I replied, calm now, "but I don't think they understood what they just set loose." Benjamin called back 2 days later. "The clause is sloppy," he said, flipping through the pages as we sat in his downtown office. "It's broad, too broad. It restricts competition, yes, but it's unenforceable in some critical areas. You can't be barred from using knowledge or skills gained through experience, and they can't stop you from working in the same field if the clients come to you voluntarily." I leaned back, not quite smiling, but breathing easier than I had in weeks. "So what you're saying is, I can't chase them, but if they come knocking, you're fine. As long as you don't solicit directly, you're in the clear. Just make yourself available." And that's exactly what I did. No launch announcement, no LinkedIn post, no fanfare. I quietly filed paperwork for a small, private consulting entity, Lane Publishing Advisory, named Without Vanity, just function. No office yet, just a P.O. box and a dedicated phone line. I didn't call anyone, I didn't reach out, but I also didn't hide. 3 days later, the phone rang. "Richard," Grant Turner said without preamble, "I hear you've set up shop." "News travels fast," I answered. "In this industry it always has," he replied. "I need help with our winter catalog. Your replacement thinks metrics matter more than instincts. I need someone who understands both." I hesitated, not out of fear, but strategy. "I'm still figuring out next steps," I said. 15,000. 2 months of strategic guidance, no conflict with your old company, will make sure of that. It was generous, structured just enough to be legal, but careful not to invite a lawsuit. After we hung up, I found myself staring at the phone again, not waiting this time, but contemplating. Because the call wasn't just a job offer. It was confirmation that I wasn't done. The next day, I met Michael Me, former assistant director at a quiet diner off Route 71, away from the downtown buzz and carefully out of sight from the industry crowd. He looked worn, older than he had a month ago, and kept checking over his shoulder before sliding into the booth. "They gave me your title," he said, voice low. "But I'm not running anything. All decisions come from the digital team. They're dismantling everything you built. The old reps can't keep up with the systems. 3 have already quit. Morale's collapsing. Clients are livid. Veronica blames transition turbulence, but the numbers are bad. Really bad. He reached into his coat and slid an envelope across the table. Updated client list, personal contacts. They trust you. They're waiting. I stared at it for a long time. This was the moment they were afraid of. The moment I could strike. The moment I could give them exactly what they feared I would become. But I didn't touch the envelope, because real revenge, if you want to call it that, doesn't come from doing what they expect. It comes from doing better. From building something so undeniable that they can't bury it under PR statements and investor slides. As Michael left the diner, I sat there alone, sipping cold coffee, a quiet plan already forming, not just to return, but to rebuild something that couldn't be dismissed again. Not a company, a community. A month passed, then another. I didn't reach out to any of the clients from my old firm, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't need to. The word was spreading on its own, not through marketing or flashy promotions, but through the whisper networks that had always powered the publishing world calls between editors, quiet recommendations, passed over lunch meetings, and the kind of trust that no algorithm could replicate. By early fall, I'd signed 3 consulting clients, all publishers I'd never worked with directly at Howden Byers, which meant no legal boundaries, no risks, and no distractions. I helped them shape catalog strategies, advised on distributor negotiations, and created pitch materials that still sounded like people talking to PO Planot departments talking to data. It wasn't flashy work, but it felt honest. It felt like home. And then, almost as if scripted by a force greater than coincidence, Harold Blackwell, chairman of the Howden Myers board, reached out. His assistant left a voicemail asking if I'd meet him for a private lunch at the Lakehurst Club, an old guard executive haven known for its mahogany walls and whispered deals. Curious, I accepted. Harold greeted me with the careful formality of a man used to being in control. But there was something tight in his eyes and stiffness in his shoulders that told me things were not going well. "Richard," he began, handing me a scotch before I'd even sat down. "Thank you for coming. I imagine you've heard things at the company aren't exactly stable." I didn't answer, just sipped my drink and waited. "We're down 38% this quarter. Our client retention has collapsed. Several of our legacy accounts have either paused business or exited altogether, and internal morale is deteriorating rapidly. The digital transition that was supposed to modernize us, it's fractured the entire foundation." His voice cracked ever so slightly on that last word. That's when I knew this wasn't a courtesy meeting. It was a lifeline. He leaned in, lowering his voice despite the privacy of the room. "The board is concerned about Elena's leadership. What she brought in technological vision, she lacked in industry understanding. We misjudged the balance. And to be transparent, your dismissal, it was never fully authorized by us. It was handled internally, unilaterally. We were informed after the fact." For a moment, I just stared at him, processing what he wasn't quite saying out loud. They hadn't just made a mistake, they'd known it was a mistake when it happened, but chose to stay silent until it cost them something that mattered. "Money. What are you asking me, Harold?" He cleared his throat and straightened his jacket, trying to reassert his posture of authority. "We want you back. Not as a regional director, but as chief client officer, reporting only to the board. You'd have full control over sales strategy and client relations, and the authority to rebuild the team as you see fit. We'll double your former compensation package, offer equity, and guarantee full autonomy." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to understand not just the offer, but the motive. And I saw it clearly. Now this wasn't about redemption or righting a wrong. This was damage control. I wasn't being invited back for who I was being recruited for who still trusted me. "What about Elena?" I asked. "She'll remain CEO," he said, his tone tightening, "but her role will be reduced in scope. The board will be revising the org structure. You'll outrank her in all matters involving client engagement." So that was it. They wanted me to clean up the very mess they had allowed to happen, to dismantle her model quietly, reinstate the legacy accounts, and calm the waters they'd stirred too violently. And perhaps later, when things stabilized, to push her out entirely. I left that meeting without accepting the offer, promising only to consider it. On the drive home, I kept thinking back to that final day at Howden Myers show. They'd let me pack my things in silence, how not a single executive had stopped to shake my hand, and how they'd watched as I walked out with everything but my pride. No, this wasn't about second chances. It was about power, and the difference between holding it and earning it. The next morning, I declined the offer in a simple, respectful email. Less than 30 minutes later, Harold replied with an increased offer and a hint of desperation buried beneath his usual polish. I didn't answer. Instead, I made 3 phone calls each to publishers who had reached out weeks earlier, offering their support but unsure where I was headed. Now, I had an answer. I wasn't going back. I was going forward. 6 months after I walked out of Halden Myers, with nothing but a box of personal belongings and a story no one would believe, I stood in the heart of our new headquarters, a renovated brick warehouse, just outside Fountain Hill, where the walls still carried the scent of ink and ambition. There was no executive suite, no mahogany desk with my nameplate engraved in brass, just an open floor, shared light, and a dozen voices in conversation about what mattered most, publishing with purpose. What had started as an idea spoken over quiet phone calls and quiet coffees had become something larger than I had ever imagined. Lane Publishing Collective Endeavor, officially named after me, but shaped by my values now, included 23 independent publishers, all of whom had once sat in boardrooms like the one I'd been dismissed from, wondering when someone would stop talking about disruption and start listening again. We had no CEO, no hierarchy for the sake of control. I wasn't in charge of anyone, but I was trusted by everyone. My role was clear: to connect people, to keep the gears turning, to remember the names that mattered and the values that couldn't be coded into a CRM. By the end of our second quarter, we had grown beyond Pennsylvania, pulling in small presses from the Midwest, the South, even one out of Portland that had walked away from a 6-figure merger to join us instead. And the industry noticed. We were featured in Literary Weekly, mentioned in the Wall Street Ledger, and one article in the Chronicle Review called us the relationship revolution that corporate publishing never saw coming. And they were right. Because we didn't offer disruption, we offered restoration. Not reinvention, but reconnection. We reminded people that books weren't data points or content units. They were stories built on trust, handled by hands that cared, and carried forward by voices that couldn't be automated. The same week our 24th member signed on, I got another call from Harold Blackwell. He said, "Halden, Myers had appointed a new CEO, someone from within, someone who still remembered when we used to walk into client offices instead of sending survey links." And then he asked, without spin, without pretense, whether there might be a place for Halden Myers inside the collective. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. I just listened and, after a pause, gave him the same answer I'd given smaller houses all along. We don't take corporations. We take people. Later that day, I walked through our workspace, where old veterans and hungry young talent shared desks and shared stories, the kind that didn't make it into press releases but somehow shaped everything we built. Michael, who had once risked his own job to warn me about the storm I didn't yet see, now helped run our outreach operations. And across the room, Eleanor Marsh sat with a group of interns, explaining how a book lives and dies not by numbers, but by the people who believe in it. As the sun began to dip behind the city skyline, I stepped outside and drove to Willow Park, a place I'd gone to think during some of the hardest chapters of my life. I sat on the same bench where I had once asked myself whether it was over, and now I knew the answer. It wasn't over. It had never been over. It was just waiting for the right kind of beginning, not born of bitterness, but shaped by quiet conviction, built not for power, but for people. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't making noise, it's making something that lasts. If you've ever been cast aside, overlooked, or told you're no longer needed, remember this: your worth isn't tied to a title, and your legacy doesn't depend on their approval. AID. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, raw stories of strength, justice, and powerful comebacks. This is the Underdog's Revenge, where dignity always wins in the end.